Good evening. Welcome to DiversiTV. I'm the host, Mark Harris, and I'll be introducing our guest tonight shortly. If you are new to DiversiTV, welcome. If you are part of our growing legion of viewers statewide, not just in the Eugene, Springfield area or Lane County, welcome back. DiversiTV is being broadcast from the studios of Lane Community College and distance learning, but you know that if you've already tuned in. And our mission is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. So within that rubric, we follow a loose format based loosely around that whole definition of diversity that comes up with institutions such as Lane, which follows roughly around race, but kind of branches out in other categories, and we try and do that because even within those broad categories, you get quite a bit of, there's no other way to say it, diversity in terms of what the stereotypes or archetypes may be. So we always start with a native perspective because we're on Turtle Island, as we did this season. And each season roughly corresponds to a LCC term, so we've been doing this for almost 4 years now. Anglo perspective, because we speak English. This year we had an Asian American perspective, Latino perspective, African American perspective this week. Next week we'll have a special treat with presentation of two-way seeing, Esther Stutzman, who's a Kalapuya, and Shannon Applegate, who is a descendant of pioneers, and their family have actually had a relationship going back almost 2 centuries now. The youth perspective, class, spirituality and religion, and if we have a Lanyap show on June 10th, we'll see what we get from there. Our guest tonight, I was having dinner at a local restaurant that our guest works at with my partner Sherry, and she'd suggested, oh, you should check out this guy who, you know, we thought at the time, because Eugene is one of those places that is, shall we say, a strange attractor for all kinds of viral or mimetic cultural mixes. The skinhead movement originally started out, or one story about it, started out in the United Kingdom among black working class youth who did active anti-racist, anti-sexist, classist work in the UK, and then that kind of morphed into what most people are more familiar with, the neo-Nazi skinhead movement that has morphed all over the planet. But there's also been movements what are referred to as sharps, that's skinheads against racial prejudice, etc., growing up in terms of participating in other youth cultures. And so there's characteristic styles of dress, which could include Levi's and Doc Martens and etc., closely shaved haircuts, as you know, just people can be stereotyped, you know, by how they wear their hair in a number of variety of ways. And so when I approached our guest tonight, Donoval Worland, welcome.
Hello.
It turned out he's not a sharp, but he does have an interesting history that was worth illuminating on DiversiTV. So, welcome.
Thank you.
So, where are you from? Because that becomes one of those inevitable questions if you weren't born and raised here.
Mm-hmm. San Francisco, California, and mostly from the Park Merced district and the Sunset district.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. So, in terms of your background, what do you feel was unique about your upbringing in the city?
My father and mother were solidly from two kind of culturally separated groups in Chicago. My father from the north side, my mother from the south side. He was a good deal older, a beatnik, while she was more of the Soli era, you know, and James Brown and Black Panthers and stuff, and specifically for those who have some idea, the Blackstone Rangers era is specifically her period of time, and so their views, though not exactly uncommon in San Francisco, because so many people are transplants, I did find in the long run were remarkably different, because they had a bit of traditional values about language and how one behaves in public and things like that, and manners and mannerisms, mores and things like that. But that liberalism and left-leaning thought and, to some degree, agnosticism rather than atheism, being a major, that's almost, that was my kind of the alternative lifestyle part of what they had to, and they had to kind of come to this because, of course, their cultural background.
and Blackstone Rangers.
Yeah, you know, these are two, you know, they had to work it out a lot.
Yeah.
And with my mother, she highly valued religion because she knew nothing else.
Right.
But she didn't ever really have a specific Christian denomination that she really was like, she knew about it and was on it. My father, he had spent his youth going to Sunday school so he could argue with the Christians, and he loved stuff like that, and that was his bag, you know. And so I went to Catholic school.
Okay.
And that was kind of the thing that changed sort of everything, where I was raised around, mostly at that time, El Salvadorians, a good portion of which I found out later, I pieced together, they were refugees from Reagan's war on El Salvador.
Right.
And Filipinos, which also were refugees from America's war on the Philippines. And, you know, they were running
the
from...
Marcos regime, et cetera.
I believe, that time
it
would have been Marcos.
Yeah.
And that and the shoe, the lady with the shoe.
Imelda.
Yeah, that was it. There we are.
The shoe lady, right.
And so that's what I was raised around. Mostly people, so I could spell any name now, you know, because I'm unaccustomed to nothing now. You know, it's all these refugees from Syria, the Philippines, all these Catholic communities that ended up in this part of town that was sort of where you kind of ended up if you weren't established earlier, if your group hadn't got its place. And because, like, there was the black communities of, you know, the Ingleside and Hunters Point and the Fillmore, and they'd been there for generations, and to the point where when I moved there, people knew they were like, "Who's that guy?" You know, and stuff, and or the Irish in the Sunset and the Chinese who finally populated the Sunset and owned, because that was the first district they could buy land in and stuff, and so it was. I was in this area that was mostly rental, you know, and all these, with this odd panoply of you know, Mahmoods and Arroyos and stuff like that, and Kwaks and Ings and stuff,
So, I mean, from my childhood, I mean, I was born in San Francisco, and we lived there for first 5 years of my life, and we moved to LA, but frequently visited. So one of the things that I remember from that time, besides, you know, growing up, you know, in ethnically distinct neighborhoods or even mixed neighborhoods, is having to be able to distinguish between the Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, et cetera, either by sight or by name, and all the other mixes that you would get, as you talked about. So that there would be a whole mix of international cultures, ethnic cultures, all kinds of different things, class, all that kind of stuff. So. And then, so if your mom was not Catholic, for example, so who decided on the Catholic education?
Actually, it was her.
It was her?
Yeah,
okay.
And she started making us go attend church and stuff. My dad was very good about it, because I think to a great extent, the first year I went to public school, it was because of where we lived in these rentals. The only place we could afford was kind of so far out. It was at Lake Merced development, way out at the edge of town. And so because we were there, they had to bus me in, because that was a district technically by statistic, you know. They had to bus me up to Lakeview, and I guess it was at Lake Yeah, I guess Lakeview is what it would, but Ocean View, that's it, the Ocean View district. And so, so I'm up at this school, and I clearly remember fighting some girl with a jerry curl. I could clearly remember this. My parents were not, they're like, no way. My mother especially, she really had, I think it was never something vocal. My dad was very vocal. It was very like, no, this is how it used to be, and I can't have you living that. That what we all went through, we should have only had to do this once. It's all the fighting, all the protesting, all the marching, all this. You shouldn't have to go through this again. And that was very much his mentality about it. Where my mother
fighting the integration battle, or
just
specifically,
just all the strife, the social strife and class strife. Yeah. He really wanted to kind of insulate me so that I could just learn. Go to school and learn. And I think it was because of what he saw in Chicago that he wanted, a relatively quiet life, and while my mother, it wasn't vocal. It was just suddenly something would change. I just no longer went there. She was, no, my son's not getting in fights in first grade. It's not happening. I don't care if he's amongst his own. That's it. We're sending him to another school, and and so it was kind of interesting how, as I reflected on it, she still had a very spiteful kind of resentment toward some of, I think, the things she went through back in the old neighborhood, and really sort of one of the trappings of, I'm not poor anymore.
Okay.
Right. And I want...
We're moving on up.
Yeah.
We have arrived.
Exactly. And that she didn't want me looking like I was, poor, and things like that. And what was funny most of all is that in San Francisco at that time, with the yuppies and all this, the people who are getting money are getting tremendous amounts of money compared to wage earners.
Yes.
Which at that time, my parents, just by where, when they settled in San Francisco, they were still at the lower levels of where they were working, even though it was, I guess at the time, it was still referred to as pink collar, and so I thought it was funny as my dad later really had to admit, he's like, no, we're poor, technically. By stats, he's like, other places would be rich, but they wouldn't have this job, and I think that the trappings, that was a big thing with my mother. Is no, you can't. You have to put your best face on. You have to, and it's just because that's the way it's done, and being a lector, I happened upon, of course, these old sayings, here and there that you're not supposed to in your mourning day be covered in ashes. You should be dressed in your finest and not shed a tear, and things like that. And so I could tell where she got a lot of this, because my grandfather was known as preacher, but he never would take them to a church because he hated preachers and their churches and they're asking for money and all that stuff, So and so I ended up in Catholic school being a lector and an altar boy with an agnostic dad and this mom who still hadn't quite come to terms with how she wanted to celebrate her love for Jesus. And I thought it was kind of cool in the long run. Because I was never settled in anything. Other people I found who their families were this. It was kind of tougher for them in the long run, in a way, for them to adjust with just different mental paradigms that other spiritual views had, or how could a culture believe that, things like that. It's I was somehow just relieved of that from the start. And it was very fortunate.
But also you had the ability to acquire, not only the education to have the language and the vocabulary to negotiate all that, but also kind of that Jesuitical questioning thing, because when I noticed the terminology, so not atheist, but agnostic, don't know, questioning, open, but, like Bill Maher says, the talking snake thing, I'm not sure about that whole story, but, okay. I'm not sure about the image of the white guy in heaven with the long white beard throwing thunderbolts from on high either, but, okay, But, we're wage earners, we're, educated, we're going to be well-spoken and, contribute to society in our own way. So what are some of the cultures, youth or otherwise, that you participate in?
I very specifically remember it was about 1987 or 88. I hear there's these kind of cool guys in the neighborhood. Now, they're mostly, these cats I think were Italian and Puerto Rican, and I didn't know what a Puerto Rican was at the time. But they obviously, somebody in their household was from the East Coast, because their accent was real odd. And these two guys, these brothers, Tony and Mario, they hung out with these older guys who I was kind of afraid of. They all were way bigger than me somehow. I don't know how. Everybody was huger than me all throughout my youth. And these guys would be playing something. I was like, what is that? Because I'd heard Run DMC on American Bandstand. See, for hip-hop fans watching, if they can imagine that. Dick Clark introducing Run DMC.
American Band.
Yeah. And I still remember that what I was hearing, I knew what I was identifying. I was like, whoa, what is it? Oh, that's Eazy-E. And who's that? And they all laughed, How could I not know who Eazy-E was?
Yeah.
And so hip-hop then became what I had to know everything. Every artist, every rhyme, had to have every album, had to have it all. Now I didn't know anything about the city, really. I knew where to get music, but I didn't know where shows were at. We didn't have a car.
Yeah.
We never had a car.
Yeah.
So once you left the city-county lines, there was just a fog, that I didn't know what was out there,
Good thing there's a good transit system out there.
Exactly. Yeah. Which, of course, being a hip-hopper in those days was great. You put your backpack on, your Walkman, with your cassette tape in there, and you go on your way, all day long, from bus to bus to bus. And so I ended up solidly being, by freshman year, I had met a guy who was a part of a real crew, and they were taggers, and they were mostly Filipino and Latino from the Mission District and around the Church Street neighborhood, and those guys would let me hang with them, and that was my hip hop experience. That was the group I was in, where the guys who would do fancy dance moves at parties and would write all over buses, and that's what I was. That's everybody I knew, and because I couldn't really deal with there were I think a lot of young people now, especially in this area, they don't really have the predatory weirdness that young people had at that time in San Francisco. And
what do you mean by that?
It's a thing I think is very American. I think other places have it, but it's better controlled by culture. And in this, we haven't come to terms with it yet. It doesn't seem to be as prevalent anymore. But young people not being kind of comfortable in their own skin. So they have to find some group that they know is different, usually through dress,
right,
and fight with them, or in some way start some tussle or some argle-bargle or whatever, And the thing that I thought was so interesting is I was solidly at a tail end culturally where it was racial in San Francisco. There were the Irish guys, and they had their look, and they had the schools that, there were schools that they just were not at in numbers, in large enough numbers you could identify them. You went to St. Ignatius, one of the most expensive Catholic schools in the city, and somehow these poor Irish cats were all there. All there,
yeah.
Or
you were at St. Stephen's?
I was at St. Stephen's School, in my primary years, And I went to Sacred Heart Cathedral freshman year, and that was really that's where all of us divided. Everybody became their group. It was one of the most interesting things to see, where the kids who had absolutely no style because we had to dress in uniforms now had the smallest lines into which they could dress. We could actually dress in different things other than uniforms, and it immediately went in very specific directions, like what kind of group everyone identified with. The Asian gangster kids, that was a movement people don't even know about for the most part outside of that area, and that was a big deal, and it was before Hong Kong was turned over.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there was a lot of heat in the streets in that culture, and you know, the Irish kids were seeing themselves as a group being pushed out of their school by the, you know, like the Cantonese kids
Right.
and the Filipino kids,
Right.
and
Those minorities or whatever, yeah.
and but also there was then the guys who were totally cool with everybody. You know, there was like the Irish kid who was just down with everyone. You know, and you know knew all the rhymes. Knew, you know, it was that kid. You know, and it was really odd, this period of time that white kids dressed in hip hop gear would get beat up by the white kids from their neighborhood. And get beat up from black kids from another neighborhood because they figure, oh, you have to have money to have all that gear,
Right.
you know, and that a lot of me and my friends, we ended up all having to dress like a lot of the old gangster guys in work clothes so that we wouldn't get all the fancy clothing stolen, because that was those days, you know, of that, and of people stealing
your
jackets.
$200 Jordans or jackets or whatever,
and so it really made this. We really were proud after a while of wearing work clothes. We really saw ourselves as, we figured it out at some point. And also hip-hop, the Chronic hadn't come out. So everything was political. You know, Do the Right Thing and School Days, and everything was political. And in 1989's a number, you know, Another Summer and all that. And so that idea of identifying with class was this short, it was a tiny little window that there was this crew in the sunset that we were all of, there was not two people of the same color, kind of, you know, and there was kind of the guy who was obviously a Sicilian and this other white guy who was Italian, but you could tell that was a Sicilian guy, and you didn't know what the other dude was, but you know, and so it was kind of interesting in that. And then there was, you know, all these other people, the Cantonese guy, the mixed guy like me, the Filipino guy, you know, and all the women around us, it was the same thing. And one of the things that was interesting was because of sort of these older holdouts in every community who are like, you can't hang with them. You know, that's what, you know, a lot of older siblings were telling a lot of.
Well, your values were we can mix with anybody who's cool with us, and then there's folks who were, you know, I guess, you know, from an indifferent era. We'd call them segregationists or whatever, or, you know, purists, or
and it was also that violent weirdness that was their day's way of identifying. You know, it's like, oh, no, you don't, you know, because you know exactly who they are, you know, and stuff like that. And so it was. I found it interesting that by the time hip hop was solidly a culture, like by around 93, 94. There was solidly a sense of identifying those who were not into hip hop, and that they had started to become like these outside groups, and that now it was this weird multicultural movement that sort of didn't like the rockers or this or the other group, and I thought that was rather fascinating that it had, to see that change, and I mean, people don't remember now that Lollapalooza, where the Ice Cube and Cypress Hill were on the Lollapalooza tour, and people don't remember that was those were the twain shall not meet. Rock and hip hop.
Rock and hip hop. Walk this way. No.
Yeah.
we shall never meet.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, how'd you come to Eugene?
I met a wonderful, wonderful young woman at massage school, and it was as if she had come from some magical
massage school
place.
In the city.
Oh yes, National Holistic Institute in Emeryville.
Okay.
I think it still exists. I'm betting it probably still does. And she had heard of it because of this community and all massage therapy. I had looked into NHI because I had done a course in acupressure, and somebody said, you know, you really should just go through the whole course, you know, and become a massage therapist. My teacher, he wanted me to become an acupuncturist, but I just didn't want to dedicate that much of my life toward a medical degree and stuff, and then have to crack the nut, you know, doing that. And so I met her there, and she every once in a while we would visit, just pay a visit to her family, which was very important to her, and they're all alive. All my family, by the way, all my family is passed on, like a long time ago.
Okay.
And so we would visit up there, and it was like a paradise where people were nice, and things were a little hard to get to, and it was a little difficult to kind of do things, but if you knew where to go and you knew how to get there, really wasn't, you know, and so I liked it, but at the time, what I saw, and the most encouraging thing I saw.
This is mid to late 90s? When was this?
This would be this would be 2000.
2000?
And
okay.
2002.
Okay.
Yes, it's the summer of 2002. I get to Eugene, and they're like, hey, well, let's play some jet hockey. She's like, I told you I'll beat you at jet hockey. And I was like, oh, okay, so jet hockey. So we walk, meander through this neighborhood. I'm not even sure where we are. It's late at night. And we hit West Broadway, but there's no street there. The street's been dug up. And I'm like, okay, no, all we got to do is just walk through this. There's this place with jet hockey. So we get to this arcade that's, of course, all ours because there's nobody there because nobody will walk on all through all this stuff. Right. And so I'm like, this is brilliant. You guys still have this. Your young people have an arcade. I was like, that's great. They closed these things years ago where I'm from, and now kids just walk around and hunt each other for jackets.
Right.
And I was just like, and I was
the predatory thing you were talking about before, because lack of recreation.
Yeah. Or actually, by the time that time came around, 2002, I mean, all that was gone. They just shop. They sit around and shop. But that's another story. Teenagers draped in gold. We get to this arcade, and I'm like, this is great. There's pool and video game, my favorite video games, because all my friends were video game testers during our 20s and stuff. And so she's like, yeah, this is one of the fun, this place has been here all my life, blah, blah, blah. And so everything about Eugene just seems really wonderful. I gotta admit, the homeless kids I saw were very reminiscent more of the kids I saw in Berkeley rather than in San Francisco, where it seemed people who were just stuck on the peninsula. Yeah. Where Berkeley, it seemed like a more hybrid, transient kind of gypsy culture that was evolving.
Like along Telegraph, etc.
And I was totally unfamiliar. I didn't look punk enough, basically, for them to talk to me. I was like, I was the biggest Dead Kennedys fan, but I was not punk enough for them. When I noticed that, I was like, now that's interesting. This apparently is one of the stops that they make, between Seattle and Portland and all that.
Eugene, one of the stations on the counterculture cross or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, of course I'd see, people with banners flying off their bikes and stuff. And I was like, wow, this, and that's what really hit me. I'm like, that would never happen in San Francisco. That it could, but at some point that person, the realities of a big city like that would crush the creative life right out of that person. At some point somebody would give them the business over them and their banner or something, or somebody would take it or just ruin it for no damn reason, that's what really turned me off of the Bay Area, was more and more I was seeing that kind of behavior. People just apparently it was that weirdness, cutting open like cloth seats on buses or just tearing things up. And I knew, from my youth, well, it's sort of this sense of quick fame or something, that you've destroyed something, and it's this really bizarre psychological thing in our culture. But I don't get when somebody's just festooning the world with their garbage, in the way that I started increasingly more and more seeing.
Well, you don't mean like physically, and you're not referring to tagging, because you've talked.
I know, yeah. And that was the thing, is, of course, ironically, I come to this point where I'm like, like I never left food on buses because that's uncool. It's like I'd sit there like, you don't want to sit on somebody's old food that's on the bus. That's not cool, man.
And why would you leave that? Put it in the trash can.
And there's trash cans everywhere. And that was the thing in my mind is. And I realized a big part of my upbringing and our group of young people were, and Ice Cube had said it in an interview. He said the whole thing of us being gangsterized, that's me putting it, and that kind of sense of culture, something that's not your family but is your family and is sort of made up by your neighbors or your neighborhood or something like that, that cultural paradigm is what enforces order when the world is chaotic.
Right.
And so Ice Cube had put it as, we thought we were guarding our neighborhood, but we didn't know against what.
Right.
And I definitely remember thinking at a certain point, all these people are moving to San Francisco and just ruining it, putting their garbage all over the place or doing this or doing that, you know. And then of course in my mind I'm thinking, well, but dude, you constantly declared every bus your territory in the name of your neighborhood's crew, you know, and it wasn't.
And when the
lost
bus
on
was
me.
actually only passing through your
Yeah, it was
neighborhood.
only passing through, only borrowing its time. Yeah, and but I definitely picked up on when I got to Eugene, there was a sense of an old school sense of, why are you throwing that in the street? You know, what is wrong with you? You know, that you could see it on people's faces when somebody would do something, that you could kind of see the whole flock sort of, what are you doing? You know, they don't say anything. Now, I noticed here, people don't say things, but you could see it on their faces, that they're just, they're aghast, you know, they just, and I wonder at times, are they not saying anything because they don't want to seem to be confrontational, or they don't want to say anything simply because they literally just don't even want to speak to somebody who would do something like that, you know, and I thought that was kind of cool, and that I was like, that I can appreciate the way that these people do their thing, you know, and yeah, and so.
I mean, in our conversation the other day, you were talking about how, you know, well, the predatory nature of the city or urban life versus what you refer to as it being, people being nicer to you, like not being suspicious if you said hello, or people saying hello, whereas, you know, someplace like a San Francisco or New York or LA, they're like, well, what do you want?
Yeah. What do you want? Yes.
But you've had interesting encounters. So what kind of interesting encounters have you experienced here?
I have, oh boy, okay.
I mean, because, for example, you know, we said, you know, the woman that you met who was from Eugene came down to the city, and you come back up, and then the contrast between the two places, I mean, so in San Francisco you had the big cultural mix, Eugene not so much, right? And so that was kind of a shock for her at one point.
Oh, certainly.
But, you know, then, you know, there are some things that, you know, environmentally, not just the environment, not throwing your trash and not trashing the buses, but it's mellower here in some aspects. But in others, it's, shall we say, interesting when we mean, you know, interesting is like weird.
Oh, yeah. Like.
So what kind of interesting encounters have you experienced?
I thought about one on the way here. I thought about, like, have I really had anybody who is just a crazy bigot, you know, do something or say something? And I thought about, okay, who are the people really, like, I kind of, my hackles went up a little, you know. And most of the time what it is are that weird cultural group that you're not sure if it was lockup or a lot of time on a Harley or just being just a white dude in the Northwest, that you could just see they have something, some adornment or ink work or something that it's like, no, hello, I hate you, you know, and it's like, and that, and I've noticed just enough that it's been often enough that it's either guys who you could just tell they're just burnt out. They're burnt out on meth or junk or something. You can just see their body. You can just see it. Or they're solidly bikers who are probably doing whatever bikers do, which I don't even want to know about. Or they're guys who you can just see by their body language. They're still looking to beat somebody up, you know, and you could see it on them,
consider,
you know?
and fitting you for their profile, huh?
You know, well, and I don't even know. It's like I just see them, and it's kind of, and I because so many of them wear lockup on them. I for a short while lived with a guy who he had been locked up for. I actually tend to befriend people who have been institutionalized in one way or another. Yes, that's the best way I've found of putting it. And institutionalization, especially men in this culture, wears a certain way. It's like a cloak they wear.
Well, I mean, that's interesting the way you put it, the metaphor of not makeup, wearing lockup.
Yeah,
right.
And you could see it on some guys. There's some guys that just know what to look for on them and stuff. Because one of my side hobbies was what are the separatists, supremacists, and maniacs up to? You know, and you know what crazy things are they up to now? And so you know,
like actual surveillance, face to face, net surveillance. What do you mean?
most of it
as a hobby.
Southern Poverty Law Center, clanwatch.com. RAR, Rock Against Racism, you know, a lot of that stuff. There's certain groups online that, you know, I'll go on their threads and they'll point out these are some of the new sites that various, you know, the completely talentless offshoots of maniacs like the American Renaissance, you know, and stuff like that. Yeah. And you know, check it out, folks, if you ever want to see what the maniacs are up to.
But be sure to wash yourself thoroughly, just like you would with the flu.
Yeah, totally. And so around town, I'll see a lot of that. But then there's this kind of group, and I didn't know they had a name. Apparently, there's a name for these guys. Like, they're kind of the Insane Clown Posse fan, white hip hop guys that I didn't know, like, other white people call them something and stuff. And so it was bros, apparently, are what they referred to them as. And so I've run into a number of these kind of characters where I remember one time specifically, apparently these guys were preparing to smoke. And so they were walking past me, and they had something tattooed on their forearms, gangster style. And I mean, chains and everything. And they're like, "What you know, fool, about the smoke?" You know, and I'm walking home. You know, I consider myself, I'm just a guy I'm just punching the clock. I live a pretty simple life. And there's just this thing of, you're the last people I want to get involved in, you know? So, you know, these shady street characters. And it was funny because apparently I wore that on my face, the utter surprise of seeing this, like, sort of ludicrous, but like a white dude doing ludicrous.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like rolling a blunt or something, walking down the street, and I mean, I'm just, what am I seeing? You know, because that didn't exist when I was young in the hip hop scene. That I mean, it started to, but it didn't really exist like that. You know, and people didn't have money for stuff like it, and so it was just kind of, that throws me off now and then, and a lot of times and I've heard you comment on this, and you're particularly involved. This area has a very severe problem with people who need mental health help. Yeah, and it's so prevalent now. My teacher had his issues that the Veterans Administration was helping him with. But he had also been very well educated, so he would tell me, when people's eyes do these things, this is nerve damage from these kind of things, these medicines do these things to these people. When you see
pharmaceuticals, yes.
Pharmaceuticals, right. Exactly, pharmaceuticals. Right. And so he said that especially if you're in areas where there's been a lot of industrial pollution, these are things to look for. And so all the years of being by a medical doctor and acupuncturist, I've realized one of the key things of this area that goes straight to the issue of class in this area is the availability of mental health help. And I've definitely noticed, I thought only black folks felt this way. I thought white people were okay with psychology. But no, it's just when you don't have money, you're not comfortable with psychology and psychiatrics and things like that.
So why do you think that is? I mean, I have an answer, but Why do you think that is?
I believe it's because there's when people are poor, they tend to hold dear to the wisdom of their ancestors, and that came out of the biblical tradition where the seed of God is in one's mind, and or to some degree, depending on school of thought. But in this era, a lot of people kind of take it that way. And if something's not right with you, so you can't doubt your mind because you are then sort of doubting God in your manifested in your life, in your own consciousness. And I think that belief is very hard on poor people, when, especially now where there's a lot of, more and more, the religion is having trouble dealing with just empirical reality and stuff. And so when suddenly somebody's not even perceiving empirical reality right, I don't, what do they do? Jesus might be coming down off the cross, in what they're seeing, and I noticed there's been quite a number of times in this city I've literally had to stop and realize, no, you're dealing with somebody just like in the Tenderloin. Life has bent them a little, and they're dented real bad, and that's just how it's going to be for them. And you're not going to help them by yelling back, at all, and don't make people's lives hard. And that was a key thing that I've definitely picked up on now in this area, is that there is also the uncomfortable silence in the room when somebody who is challenged in some way, mentally or physically, by disability or contracted illness or something.
Or life.
Or life. And that people here are still kind of culturally figuring it out, because there's sort of that thing of, I moved to the Northwest to be free on the edge of the world and
to get away from all the urban blight or whatever.
And all the crazy people and stuff like that. And it's like, well, now that you live in this state where one of the only places anybody can be helped for these services is in one city out of hundreds of miles of expanse, they're going to concentrate someplace. And this area is not preparing long term for this. They're not preparing long term for the retirement that's going to start happening. And they're definitely not preparing for what are they going to do when all these retirees still require heart meds that are psych meds, or internal medicine meds that are psych meds on top, or have side effects that are
begin
happen
to
up
warp
here.
you and basically change your consciousness in ways that make you not appear normal.
Yeah, and I've found that definitely there's. I'm actually surprised at sort of how well this city is dealing with race in this period of time. Like, I think it's because of the job losses from back a decade ago that people are sort of, I guess maybe the bigots are spent. I don't know, or something,
You might get some debate from some quarters.
No, I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure. But, it's, but definitely there's this thing that I'm starting to pick up on, that people seem to be sort of like, hey, things are changing, and how I just need to eke out a living now. I just don't have time to blame it on somebody who probably has no more money than I do, and I think that's a big deal, and especially being also the only minorities most Oregonians are seeing are guys who are working on mint fields and grass seed fields, because none of the Mennonite kids in the neighborhood will do it anymore. Yeah, and it's. So they're like, here's... And
they used to, and they don't.
Yeah, they used to, and especially now, it's like, just like a lot of the hippies. A lot of those cats they're rich now. They're rich Mennonites. They can afford any suspenders they want. It's like.
So when you described yourself as working with people who wear lockup, that's not your job in terms of employment, but you do it as a public service. So, and there's more and more of them, being released every month. Certainly on the close order from the state and federal system of like 40 or 50 folks a month. Yeah. And so, being able to detect somebody wearing lockup, as you say, what are some of the things you do with them?
I try to see what language they're used to being, like what do they prefer as far as the kind of language used. And it was lucky I was a lector, because I got better and better, and also that I love.
Explain what a lector is
for
the non-Catholics out there.
In the Catholic community, after Vatican II, the Council of Vatican, the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II is what we call it. This was in 1972, I believe, so it was right before I was born. They decided that the Holy Canon could be presented in English, or the language of every region. It was before in Latin, and I think in very rare cases, the language around there. And so the lector is one of the only positions by a lay person to read the Old Testament. The New Testament is not allowed to be read to the community by anybody but a priest, or I think possibly a deacon in some very specific cases. I think actually it would be anything that Jesus would not have been speaking in. Like, so the Apostle John, or the Apocalypse and stuff like that. So as a lector, I realized, and watching actors, especially a lot of black actors, and then Frank Sinatra, that there's certain things could be done with the voice. There's certain ways that you lilt, and it was watching also a Motown singer, and watching her. There was some piece of training footage where she was being trained on how to sing, and the hand gestures, and everything was exacting. And then when dealing with people who've been incarcerated and institutionalized, one has to know your words have to hit with only a certain pressure, because they only know to push back, or they're really scarred and they'll fold, and usually that's when they, like, people encounter these people as usually the mumbling weirdo, things like that. They're like, this guy's just mumbling, I don't know, and it's like, well, no, it's this, something bad happened to this guy, and if you put too much pressure on him, he will start mumbling because he's afraid of you. He immediately turns on fear, and other people who they puff up, they puff back, and so a lot of times I have to, like, if it's usually a white dude,
as a defense mechanism.
Right. And it's usually, if it's a white dude, I make sure I round out my R's.
Okay.
It's how are you doing? I try to make it so that the language isn't where they're suddenly talking to some brother, as they in their mind as they in lockup, and sometimes even if I could get if I could crack their ego for a minute and get them to laugh, or some, I'll even throw in something like, oh, you know what I mean there, and try to make it funny. Because they were men, they joked constantly. That was probably all they had. It was joking, and so I try to do that real fast to get them to laugh, or to let them know, you are a guest in this establishment. I take care of everyone under here. And because that's very important to me as a Taoist. That idea of, when you're under my roof, you know I'm the master because I'm taking care of you. Okay. That you could turn to me for help. That's mastery. And I think a lot of Americans misunderstand power and things like that, and they don't understand that.
Well, you can have authority without domination.
That's, they don't understand graciousness.
Concept, so you picked that up from your healing work? Where?
Actually, a lot from my teacher, because his background was, let's say, a little out of the ordinary for most people, and he had been steeped in the military tradition, both culturally and kind of what the function of the men in his family did. And so he really put me on to watch how people move, watch how their voice alters, watch what their eyes do. He's like, everything is clearly revealed. There's nothing that's hidden from you at any time. And so
That's a good piece. Very simple, very direct.
And
anybody can do it.
Exactly. And everyone has that power. They just have to get through this. They just have to get through the thickness of their skull to realize they're seeing everything they need to see clearly.
Right.
And it was my housemate, who also became a student of my teacher, who his experience in lockup was really traumatizing. Like, he really, putting him through exercises, I realized what the purpose of Qigong and Tai Chi, what the purpose of all that was for, the yoga, because it
a mind-body discipline after you've been injured in one sense.
Yeah, I mean, he had yokes for days, but I mean, it would break him, and it would, and you could just see his whole consciousness was just going nuts. You know, he didn't know what to do because all that weirdness and hostility, all that poison that he had to live in all the time, just so warped the way his mind and spirit and body met, and yeah, it was and that's what I look for that now. That's why also we had students who we did have a student who actually did have to take antipsychotic medications, and one student who you might be somewhat familiar with, Idris Stelly. Yes, he was a student of my teacher. He was dating my teacher's daughter at the time he was shot by the police. Yeah, I trained him actually for a period of time, and so yeah, I was watching, because also I don't want that to happen again.
Right.
And people should know that there is a difference between simply hostile behavior and somebody who is confused or is not perceiving reality. But it's hard, it's incredibly difficult for people to know that.
I mean, and you're facing your own fears with a lot of those folks. I mean, and that's the thing about, they're human, and a lot of times they're attempting to make adaptations to essentially insane situations in a sane way. Basically, everybody has that tendency towards sanity, but they don't necessarily know how to do that. So they get yoked inside because they're putting this anger and frustration into a repetitive motion, which, you know, is building them up. But their mental defenses, you know, and their mental strength is not being accordingly built up. And, you know, when you're talking about mind, body, and spirit, using those disciplines, whatever those particular things were that you were talking about, tried to bring those two together, and it's difficult for those folks, you know, and certainly, you know, with that Idris situation, you know, I don't know if you want to talk about that in like 2 minutes. We got
actually, there is something I'm realizing based, you know, that in the vein of this. One of the things I think people don't get about that issue. So this was a young man who he was shot in a movie theater by the San Francisco Police Department when he started smoking a cigarette during a movie, and it was because he hadn't been taking meds for a certain mental ailment, and he refused to put out the cigarette, and eventually the police were called because he refused to leave. It's not a small guy, and I mean, I trained him, and he darn near knocked me out a couple times. You know, he's a good fighter, and so
in which particular art?
It was Okinawan Kempo.
Okay,
but he was
karate.
He was an amazing wrestler prior to that, and very physically skilled. Spoke 3 languages. He had been raised in France as a half mixed, basically North African Muslim, and his mother was a white Parisian, and if anybody knows anything about what it's like being a Muslim in Paris, you know, what would have been during the early 80s and mixed and all this would have been a very tough thing. And so when he got to the States, he's suddenly black.
Right.
You know, and he doesn't even know what a black person really is.
Right. What is that?
And then, of course, he's now around a culture that is nothing like a North African culture. That does not behave like Catholic Parisians nor Muslim, you know, North Africans. And so he never quite it never all came together for him. And if he had stayed on his meds, he could have had, and had gotten very good psychotherapy. He could have done very well. But his culture didn't have a reference to set him right, and he looked desperately. That's why the martial arts appealed. Buddhism, pantheism, all these things appealed to try to explain why the empirical world was not matching what was happening in his head.
Yeah.
And I think this area attracts a lot of people who kind of are, I mean, like me.
Are
sort of like that. We
multiple
don't have,
worlds crisscrossing,
yes.
and how do you explain it?
Yeah,
when a religion from 3,000 years ago doesn't explain
exactly.
the 21st century,
or the religion from 3,000 years ago that we were raised with doesn't explain what's happening, but this other one, does.
Right.
And I think that's a very interesting thing now for this culture here to start thinking about, especially the people who are conservatively Christian, is where do they find allies? Because the left needs to do it too. We need to find where do people, at the end of the day, want the same thing, despite how their cosmology is constructed.
Their cosmology or their dress or whatever. Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah.
Final thoughts?
I would really like it if people would look into the Ready Steady Soul Club that I started. I would really, if you would possibly add us on MySpace, because I'm trying to help people there's a group of us who are oddly enough, skinheads doing soul music, who, most people would never think that. That's what we pretty much do, is have taco nights and soul music. And when there's been a number of good ones that have happened, John Henry's is supporting us. Joe's Bar and Grill is supporting us. There's one coming up at John Henry's this month, a soul night and old reggae night. And we're really hoping we could get people into the roots sound out there, because, there's stuff being played that probably hasn't been heard in this city ever. And artists that nobody would ever know about. But they're what made the music.
All right. Thank you for coming.
Oh, well, thank you very
Worland.
much. Yeah.
If you like what you've seen, email us at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Put DiversiTV in the subject line and tell a friend about this show. Till then, go well, stay well.